I am Megan Dyer, and I'm the 4-H agent here in Page County, and I am for the soil because it is the foundation for producing our plants and our food systems.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee. Dr. Eric Benfelt, he is with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability. Dr. Benfelt is taking a week off, and he'll be back with us in the very near future, and we look forward to his return. But joining us as my co-host today, Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Mary, would you introduce our special guest today?
Thanks, Jeff, and really grateful to have Dr. Wayne Teel with us today. Dr. Teel is a professor of geography at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. He has a master's in natural resources and PhD in agroforestry, soil science, and international agriculture. And his research interests focus and include agroforestry, biochar, permaculture, and water. So really an interdisciplinary approach. And he has also spent extensive time internationally, including in Sudan, Kenya, and Mozambique. And so excited to hear about the international experience and how that relates to work in Virginia. So Dr. Teel, thank you for being here today. And I guess to start things off, would love to just hear a little bit about your background and how you got into the work you're doing, specifically such an interdisciplinary focus.
Okay, I suspect it goes way back to when I was in grade school, even. I don't know. My dad bought a farm in Eastern Washington. He grew up on a wheat farm, so we had a little experience with that. And I started getting involved just by going over and working on summers on this farm. I was from Seattle, but the farm was in the Columbia Basin in Washington. And so that got me interested in how agriculture works, what the consequences are for soil, other kinds of things. And so I just sort of stayed connected with it, even though my college education was urban and more chemistry oriented. But it was really going to Africa that got me connected with the agricultural activities that subsistence farmers used in various places. And I could see the difference between those who were quite successful at it and those who weren't. And a lot of it had to do with how they took care of soil and how they integrated the activities they were doing with the environment that they were surrounded by. And that eventually got me into working with the International Council for Research in Agroforestry. So I spent a year with them. And during that time, I got very connected with people thinking about native trees. A lot of times what was going on in places like Kenya was they tended to adopt the practices going on by pushed by the colonial government. And so they plant exotic trees because the British knew about Australian trees more than they do about Kenyan ones. But it turns out that there were a lot of good Kenyan ones too. And so why can't we push that? And then there was always a connection between those trees and the quality of the soil. So when I went to Cornell finally to work on the doctorate degree, those connections had already been made in the field. And so it wasn't very difficult to get into soil science and international agriculture and connect that with the agroforestry stuff that I brought with me. It's an interesting program because the agroforestry hadn't really started at Cornell at that time. So the graduate students actually brought the agroforestry to the program and jammed it into the natural resources department where there was professorial interest in it. And we helped build it up at that point. But a lot of us that were in that already had international experience, and that's why the agroforestry thing became a sort of part of the triad. But I learned a lot about soils and other things there.
I have so many questions. I'm not sure where to start.
Yeah.
Let's start with terminology. All of our listeners, I think, are familiar with terminology, agriculture and forestry. But agroforestry, how do you define that?
I had a friend there. He was from Switzerland. His name was Andreas Spike. And he said one time that if you have a farm and you have a goat, and the goat eats the tree, and you manage that interaction, then you're doing agroforestry. It's really quite simple in many ways. It's just reincorporating the forest with the agricultural activities that you're doing. It's making that connection. And that was always a connection, even in early agriculture. It goes way back to the Romans, where you have silviculture and agriculture next to each other. And the silva always helped fertilize the agro, which is the crop field. And so we have distanced that in the modern era, pushing the forest away from the agriculture. And agroforestry is really trying to bring that back together again. And so you have a nitrogen fixing tree contributing leaves to the soil that then break down and benefit the crop. That's a relatively simple agroforestry interaction. But we've also discovered things like a shade benefits cattle because they like to nap under the tree and chew the cud during the heat of the day. If they have shade, their milk production goes up. So keep the shade closer to the pasture. And that interaction happens. And the cattle might even eat some of the product of the tree. And so if you manage those interactions, you're doing agroforestry.
Very neat. And what I love with agroforestry is it's one of the core principles of soil health we talk about is energize with diversity. And a lot of folks think of different plant species, but trees being a type of diversity that is beneficial to the soil.
Right.
And I know a lot of your background with agroforestry is international. Do those principles and lessons that you were applying in Africa apply in Virginia? What are the similarities and differences you've seen?
There's a lot of application that applies essentially everywhere. And let me use the big example that we have in Virginia, and that has to do with the streams. So when we look at a stream and you get erosion along the stream, you can often identify the problem as allowing the agricultural activity to get too close to the stream. And one of the 5 kind of areas that they emphasize in agroforestry is riparian buffers. And so we're big on pushing that here. And if you can plant the right species, the riparian buffer then becomes a way to both mitigate any problems with the stream itself, but becomes a source for nutrient that you can move back uphill into the agricultural area as well. And so you can have that interaction then going on again and healing. In Kenya, the same kind of situations happen in Mozambique too, where they farm a little bit too close. And so you put your perennials, it doesn't necessarily have to be trees, it can be grasses too, where you have a deep-rooted root system that holds the soil and blocks any movement of water on the surface before it can get in the stream, protecting the stream. But then that material then becomes fodder for goats or fodder for cattle and stuff that you can take from that area and move it to the animals. Then the animal fertilizer then goes on your crop. And so you get this interactive process. And so implementing it here is a little different because we have a lot more mechanization, and that makes it the interactions different, but really it's the same kind of process where you're trying to make these reconnections of diversity between the agricultural field and the tree field.
We're talking today with Dr. Wayne Teel, professor at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And Dr. Teel, I really want to talk with you about biochar, but I'm going to save that topic for our next episode. I hope that you'll stay with us to record 2 episodes, and I want to do, if you will, kind of a deep dive into biochar. There's a lot of interest out there about biochar as it relates to soil health and energy within the soil. So, but the other thing you mentioned riparian buffers, and that really it struck a note with me because in talking with farmers in the area that you live in the Shenandoah Valley in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, there's a lot of interest in establishing riparian buffers. And there is even some incentive from the federal government, from the state government for farmers to do this. Explain a little bit more about what a riparian buffer is, and in a perfect world, what is it made of? What is there a cover crop? Is it clover, grass, a mix of grass and trees, shrubs? Take us into it.
Okay. this is a complex in some ways because you have to think about where you are in an ecosystem. So you have to think about the climate, the weather, other kinds of things. And so where you are in Virginia is going to determine what kind of species you have along the stream. And so you need to look at what is natural in an area. And we have a few areas where it's kind of natural. And so you look in those places and you start to find, okay, what trees can do well with their feet wet? Or what plants do well with their feet wet?
A birch
And
tree.
then you can select for the ones that have the maximum benefit for your agar, the agricultural area that you've got. There are some, of course, that are quite natural and easy to sort of think about. Okay, sycamore is always going to grow in a stream. So is willow and other things. But we may not think about black walnut or some other trees that like to have wet root systems, and those can grow along the stream, but they can also provide a product. Now, black walnut may not be great for your tomatoes, but it still produces a nut that you can sell and use. And so you can think about it in terms of products. And so a lot of times the people that develop these riparian buffers look at the type of product they can withdraw from it. And so walnut is just one, but there are many.
And Dr. Teel, I know we just have a few minutes left, but would love to just hear a little bit about your role in education. So I know you really have a interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach, and you're a professor in geography, which, you know, when I think of geography, there's the land use, landscape component, but there's also a very human component to it. And mixing that science, that physical science with social science and how that all plays together. How do you present that really multidisciplinary approach to students and encourage them to see the world that way?
Oh, that's a good question. I think part of it is just stories. One of the things that has always come into my teaching is that I learn from people who are actually doing it in the field. And if I can tell their story in the classroom and show how they have integrated some of these ideas already, and in fact, maybe even given me the idea from their own practice, then I can connect them with these things. And so part of what I do when I teach, especially with agriculture, is I give them stories of a particular person that said, okay, this is great. This is what I can do. This guy in Africa or this guy here in the Shenandoah Valley is doing this. So this is a very practical and applied way to do it. So telling the story about people who interact. And one of my favorite ones was a guy named Alessandro in Mozambique. He had some lucena trees that were on his property, but he didn't know that they were legumes. And so I told him how to use them as a mulch on his farm. And then I just left him alone for 3 months and came back and saw what he was doing. And then he'd already figured out that he could use this on a regular basis. And so he throughout the experiment he was doing, because he thought the results were better than he expected, and then did it on his whole farm and then expanded his number of lucena trees. So you just, through that story, then the students in my classes can hear, oh, okay, the idea is just try it on a small scale and let it expand. And this is how farmers often do things. They'll try something small that won't affect their existing protocols, but if they work, then they expand them. And I try to connect them with those kinds of stories in classes. And that seems to work pretty well.
We're talking today with Dr. Wayne Teel, professor at James Madison University. Just about a minute or so remaining in this particular episode, but we hope you'll join us for a second episode and we can do that deep dive into biochar, because I have a lot of questions about soil health and biochar. But my final question, Dr. Teel, is about resources. For your students, are they learning from books? Are they learning from YouTube videos? Are they learning from podcasts? Obviously, they're learning about soil health in your classroom. We know that, but where are the younger generation? What are their resources?
Well, they have so many, and they can grab things from a variety of different sources that you've already named. But the one that seems to have the most impact over the long term is if I can connect them directly to a farmer or a field experience that they can then take the book learning and connect it with what these farmers are actually doing in the field and say, oh yeah, this is where it comes out here. And so I try to do as much as I can to connect the students with a real activity, whether it's on the JMU campus where we go outside, or it's to some of the surrounding farmers. Even developing an internship program with a colleague, so they could actually work a semester on a farm on a regular basis in order to get that kind of applied experience, which is the best way to learn. And they need that.
Very well said. Boy, if I were 18 again, I would want to be in your classroom. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing our conversation with Dr. Wayne Teel, professor at James Madison University. And thank you, Mary, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dr. Teel.
For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you should have a specific question about soil health, call your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a soil and water conservation district office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.